Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to the show. Today I'm speaking to Dr. Kelvin Kim. He's a physicist and the head of Nuclear Africa. He was also a director of NERSA at one stage. And first of all, Dr. Kelvin, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Hugo. It's very nice to be here.
Yeah, so I guess we should start here. Nuclear energy. South Africa is not always associated as or thought of as a country that's got nuclear energy, but we have Koeberg. And we had Pelindaba, and we actually was one of the few countries in the world to develop nuclear bombs, right? We beat the Germans and the Australians to it, and they, still haven't gotten over that fact. So I guess I will start this question. Is nuclear energy in South Africa or nuclear science at all in a healthy state at the moment, according to you?
I believe it's in a very healthy state. Unfortunately, during the last few years, it went through a bit of a dip, as the rest of the world did in this respect. But South Africa is actually one of the oldest nuclear countries in the world. You mentioned NECSA. NECSA, in fact, dates its origins to 1948, when an act of parliament created the precursor to what is today NECSA, which is a large operation. And it has a nuclear reactor there, a research reactor called Safari 1. And Safari's been operating for 55 years now, which is pretty good, and it's going well. And it's the only reactor in the world that runs 24 hours a day throughout the year, producing nuclear medicine for worldwide distribution. Wow. We also have the most southerly nuclear power station in the world, Koeberg, which sits down at the southern point of Africa, just a little bit west of Cape Town up the coast. And that has also been running for close on 40 years now, and is in line for a life extension for another 20 years or plus. And so overall, that's doing well. And South Africa has very good nuclear professionals. At one point, we had a huge team working on the Pebble Bed Modular Reactor, the PBMR project. And we were world leaders in the field at the time. Then that went into somewhat of a hibernation. But thankfully, the current Minister of what is now Mineral and Energy Affairs, combined portfolio, Mr. Gwedi Mantashe, is coming out in a more positive nuclear framework. And he's encouraging the scientists and the engineers to think of going ahead, not only with large-scale nuclear for the future, but also for the SMRs, the fourth generation nuclear power. So overall, I think things are looking good at the moment, but we've got to pull ourselves up a bit from the higher point we were at a few years ago.
So let's talk about the Minister Gwedi Mantashe. I mean, I was highly skeptical, I must admit, when he got in, the appointment as Minister of Energy, and he has amazed me, to be honest, with his dedication to nuclear energy, and he seems to understand energy in general. It's actually quite optimistic to see that South Africa has looked into nuclear energy. You mentioned that pharmaceutical technologies is derived from nuclear energy. It's something that we tend to forget. In France, they've got a big pharmaceutical industry, as in Barcelona, and a lot of the isotopes are used for cancer treatment. Can you maybe, I think let's start there with the first Gwedi Mantashe and then the byproducts of nuclear, and then from there we move back to I would say, the energy in general.
Yes, I think one must remember that when you talk about nuclear technology, the actual nuclear part of nuclear technology is relatively small. There's all the associated technology goes with it, like high integrity valves, pumping systems, the chemistry, the extreme quality control, the general culture of safety, and so on. And all of that is very valuable for use, for example, in aerospace and oil and gas business and in pharmaceuticals and so on. So there's a huge amount of spin-off. In the case of NECSA in South Africa, there's also a significant chemicals capability based on fluorine gas, because South Africa developed the fluorine technology to be able to work with the fluorine gas required for uranium enrichment, which was done. But now that there's this fluorine capability, there's a number of chemicals which are manufactured from the fluorine and which are in use all over the place, ranging from toothpaste to etching microcircuits on electronics and so on and so forth. So all of that comes about because of the high level of technology that has to go into the nuclear processes. Nuclear is not just stuff that's radioactive all of the time. There's a lot more to it than that.
Yeah, and the risks of radioactivity is always something that makes me laugh when people say there's radioactivity without realizing your light bulb is probably giving you radioactivity every day. You know, there's what we call ALARA standards in France, at least as low as reasonably acceptable.
Yeah.
And a lot of this stuff about with nuclear waste being dangerous is just, in my view, complete ignorance. There is obviously dangerous, highly enriched, waste, but that's such a small fraction of the tiny waste that it's it's astonishing what the media and the people can get away with, simply because they don't know what they're talking about. I guess let's move to nuclear power. South Africa's got Koeberg, and Koeberg, as you say, is due for an upgrade. Now, recently was an earthquake, close to Cape Town, and as you know, whenever there's an earthquake and there's a nuclear power station, people automatically think of Fukushima. And that happens to be one thing that I did my specialty in, was nuclear, resistance of nuclear stations against earthquakes. Can you maybe explain to the public at least why we shouldn't be worried about Koeberg all of a sudden going to flood like with a tsunami and going to blow up?
Okay, well, for starters, Koeberg was designed to a higher earthquake standard and tsunami standard than was Fukushima. And at the time, South African engineers, when Koeberg was being proposed, indicated that they wanted an earthquake resistance built in. And that is the case. In fact, it's one of the first nuclear power stations in the world to get such a system. There's a system underground. There's 5 meters of special ground that was packed onto the bedrock. On top of that, there's 3 meters of concrete. And on top of that, there's a bronze beryllium system of plates that if there's any movement, the entire nuclear island of the reactor complex will shift somewhat. And this will take a Richter impact of greater than 7 on the Richter scale. Now, you mentioned the little earthquake there was in Cape Town a few days ago. In fact, it was an earth movement. I hesitate to even call it an earthquake. It was 3.5 on the Richter scale. And you quite correctly point out that people started to worry. And many, I think, don't realize that the Richter scale is logarithmic. So 4 is 10 times greater than 3. So 7 is way, 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 way higher than the small 3.5. And the highest tsunamis ever been recorded on that coast is something about this high. They'll sort of barely go over your foot if you're standing on the edge of the ocean. And yet it was designed to a higher tsunami spec than was Fukushima. But I would even like to, at this point, throw in that I wrote an article a few years ago on Fukushima, which was published in the United States, and the editor chose the title, and it said Fukushima was not a nuclear accident attributable to me. And I say that is the case. That was in the body of the article. I didn't intend they were going to make it the headline. But in fact, at Fukushima, nobody, 0, died from nuclear radiation. Nobody, 0, died from any radiation effects. There was no damage to public property, private property from nuclear radiation at all. So in fact, Fukushima was an industrial accident in the same category as the oil refinery or the airport or something else that got smashed up. There's no doubt that Fukushima was a disaster for the owners of the plant, a financial disaster. Now, some people have jumped on the bandwagon and criticized me, saying that I said Fukushima wasn't a disaster. I never said that. I said Fukushima was not a nuclear disaster. Just because it happens to be a nuclear plant doesn't mean it was nuclear. Just like when the airport gets smashed up, you don't call it an aircraft disaster. It's an airport disaster where the airport got broken. So even that, there's an exaggeration in the minds of the public of the world as to the dangers of nuclear. Now, you mentioned the nuclear waste and so on and so forth. I would like to make an analogy with something like explosives in the mines or military ammunition. A really dangerous place in principle is to be in an explosive store on a South African gold mine where all the explosives are kept. But you don't go in there and smoke a cigarette. You don't go into a military ammunition dump and with a hammer play a tune on one of the artillery shells. There's rules and regulations and procedures. And military ammunition is moved very safely. It is stored very safely. Explosives for mines are moved very safely and stored very safely on condition that you obey the rules and you use professionals to do the job, which we do, and nobody has any problem with it. The same is true of nuclear waste. It's undoubtedly the case that high-level nuclear waste can kill you in moments. There's no doubt about it.
Right.
So you don't go and fool around with high-level nuclear waste. But professionals don't do that. The professionals dealing with high-level nuclear waste have got very strict procedures, and it's all done in a very professional manner. And so, the public mustn't panic. But I'd also be the first person to admit that nuclear scientists and engineers worldwide, for a long time now, have been very poor at communicating with the public. They've made the assumption that the public will believe them and so on, which is not the case, because when the anti-nuclear lobby gets in, they spread stories in such an emotive fashion that quite clearly it spooks the public. So it's been a failure on the part of the nuclear community worldwide not to have done a lot more public communications in a manner that people can understand. So I have sympathy, and I think the nuclear community needs to do a lot more of that.
I totally agree. I think we need a good PR campaign. I think since then, because when you read about nuclear in the media, it is Chernobyl, it is Fukushima, and even Chernobyl, I think there were 60 people that died, if I looked the other day. Tragic as it was, it's not the end of the world. They think Hiroshima is going to happen whenever you build a nuclear power station. It's just simply false. What I think, though, is happening here is something that the psychologist Steven Pinker looked at, and he said that people don't attribute waste based on a rational metric. They don't, calculate the number of deaths and say, well, this is better than the alternative. Unfortunately, they do it compared to what is called the availability heuristic. How easily can you recall an example from history? And when you say nuclear to people, they think Hiroshima, unfortunately. And that is something I think that there's a need for a big public education in nuclear energy. Advantages of nuclear energy. Let's get there. Nuclear energy is enormously dense. Okay, it is. I mean, I would probably show a graph afterwards on the show about how dense it is. But can you maybe explain to people the misconception they've got with energy density? Let's start there.
Yes, I can. You mentioned Koeberg earlier. Koeberg is 2,000 megawatts output. If Koeberg was a coal-fired power station, it would use 6 train loads of coal per day. In fact, it uses a truckload of nuclear fuel per annum. And once the reactor is loaded, a reactor runs for 18 months. And you've got some latitude as to when to refuel it. So at Koeberg, for example, there's 2 reactors. And the power station manager knows that each one will run for 18 months, 1.5 years before refueling. So he knows the date at which, say, reactor number 1 will need a refuel. And if he wants to do it a month earlier, a month later or something, he can do that. He's got the latitude to say there's some reason why I'm going to take the opportunity of doing it a month earlier because something else has happened, or he might be able to delay it a month later, something like that. That's not the case if you've got coal. If coal is coming in and the coal supply stops, you've got a bit of a stockpile. It might be a day or 2 or 3 or a fortnight or whatever. And then when that runs out, you've had it. You don't just say, I'll just wait for a while, the coal has stopped flowing, but you can do that with nuclear. Now, I would like to particularly mention here large nuclear and small nuclear, because you talk about misconceptions. Now, in the case of Koeberg, as I said, it's 2,000 megawatts. The larger reactors are 1,200, 1,500 are the types of figures for the modern single reactor. However, there's the class of small modular reactors, and they're down at about 100 megawatts. So it's something like 5% of the large one. And the small modular reactors is a completely different ballgame. And the reason why I particularly mention it is that you asked me to address all of Africa. There are many African countries that are ideally suited for small modular reactors, small nuclear reactors. In fact, virtually all of them. And one of the main reasons is this fuel issue, that the fuel can be stockpiled if you want to. Whether or not you stockpile the fuel will be a political and economic consideration, not a technological one. If somebody wanted to, they could build a small modular reactor in Zambia, Uganda, Kenya, Rwanda. Any one of those countries, for example, can do that. And if they wanted to, they could decide to have a year's worth of supply, a year's worth of fuel in stock and supply in bunkers. That could technologically be done, which you couldn't conceivably do with coal or any of the other supplies. And so it's incredibly advantageous from that point of view, because obviously Africa is big. people do not realize how big Africa is. Africa is larger than China, the United States, Europe, and India, and Japan added together, for example.
Right.
It's huge. Now, South Africa alone is the same size as the whole of Western Europe. So the distance from Pretoria, which is where I am now, the capital of South Africa, down to Cape Town, which is where Coburg is, that distance is the same as Rome to London. Now, in South Africa's case, we supply by far the majority of the electricity in the country as coal-fired, which comes from the northeast. That's further up, so to speak, than Pretoria, northeast of Pretoria. And that's where most of the large coal-fired power stations are clustered near the coal mines, of course. You'll find that in Cape Town, the Coburg nuclear power station supplies about half the power of the Western Cape region, but the other half is effectively coming from the coal.
Right.
I've been in London and said to people in London, how would you like it if half of London's power was supplied from Rome? And they look staggered and say, we would never do anything so dopey. That is just strategically ridiculous. And that's exactly the reaction they get. But Cape Town has got half its electricity coming from the other side of Pretoria.
All
now,
the
if you
way
double
from
the size of the
Mpumalanga?
economy, which is an objective, you put yourself in a more risky situation by doing that. So we desperately need to put nuclear around the coastline of the three capes, Eastern, Western, and Northern Cape, but also allow for smaller reactors to be put further inland near where the mining centers are, and then into other countries. So it's, to my mind, it's just logical.
So let's talk about two critiques against nuclear. That are, first one is, I think the fears are overblown, it's complete nonsense. But there is a one about costs, okay? And pro-nuclear proponents, sometimes have to admit that Hinkley Point, for example, is running over budget. Flamanville in France, all these EPR reactors. Is it, first of all, true that nuclear costs more money? Because, you've got construction costs being high, but very low operations cost. Okay, so, is it competitive, I guess, is the question. And then the second one, if it is expensive, how do we bring down the cost?
Well, my opinion is that it's not expensive. You need to look at a whole life cycle cost. Now, in the case of Coburg is currently supplying South Africa's cheapest electricity by far. And it's getting close now to a 40-year time period that has been operational. And there's a legal move on at the moment to do an extension for another 20 years. In fact, the technical people say it'll go 2030 or something beyond that. So it's not limited to another 20. The capital cost is paid for. So what will happen from now on, the next 20 or 30 years, is Coburg will continue to produce very inexpensive electricity in comparison to anything else. So you got to look at the life cycle. Clearly, a nuclear plant is capital intensive up front. You've got to build the plant. But once you've built the plant, because you build it very well, and there's very stringent building specifications on nuclear, and then very stringent operating specs and standards as well, you will then be very careful to look after it properly, which has happened in the case of Coburg. So therefore, you start to get your money back. I make an analogy. It's the difference between buying a house and renting a house. If you buy a house, you've got to sign on the dotted line for a large amount of money, usually much more money than you possess on the day that you buy it. And then you have a bond which lasts, say, for 25 years, and for 25 years, you pay it off. After you've paid it off, you then live in the house very inexpensively because you're only paying your municipal rates and lights and water bill and so on, but the house has been paid for. On the other hand, if you rent it up front, you would be carrying on paying rent forever with the rent actually increasing. Right. Nuclear is like buying the house, and something else like using wind or solar is like renting. That's the difference. So people got to understand. Now, you say that some reactors have been very expensive. Unfortunately, the extreme anti-nuclear lobby often take some of the worst illustrations in the world and make them the norm. Something that I'm rather proud of is that the Baraka nuclear reactor now in the UAE, their first nuclear plant, has now started delivering electricity onto their grid. They're terribly proud of it. And what makes me proud of it is that there's 140 South Africans working on the Baraka plant, many in very senior positions, like Daryl Lapluan being the chief of Unit 1, And he was so excited when they started delivering real electricity. They were all dancing around in the control room, and I got a photograph of that. So there's this team of South Africans there that has come in essentially on time and on budget. And what's more, the budget that they had was the same figures that South Africa had calculated for a 9,600 megawatt addition some 10 years ago. It's approximately the same if you look at what it's going to cost us to produce the electricity.
So to you,
the calculations were correct. So it's completely wrong to look at our cost of pouring concrete and then try and say that in Finland it costs so much to pour concrete, and maybe in France it costs so much, therefore that's what it's going to cost for us. Of course it won't. Now, another factor as well is that obviously automatically a large amount of the money is spent domestically. We do not import people to mix concrete and pour concrete when we're building the foundations for a nuclear plant. It'll be done by locals. The same goes for the concrete walls, the underground piping, the electrical cabling, the control. When you start to think of this thing rising from the ground upwards like that and say, at what point can we not use locals? The answer is it's a difficult thing to decide. Obviously, we have an interaction with a foreign partner whose plans we use, and we interact with their engineers to put the system together. But we don't need foreign people to come and join the pipes and lay the cables and all that. That automatically is done by locals, so money is spent here. So when we were proposing large nuclear here, which I'm glad to say the current minister, Gwedi Mantashe, seems to be back on track with that. When it was being proposed, there were people saying, no, but we're going to write out one check and put it in the post and send it to some foreign country. And somehow we're all going to sit on a hill with a pair of binoculars and watch all these foreigners arrive and build a nuclear plant completely. That was just plain and simply silly. And that incorrect image was deliberately propagated. And that was wrong.
So there's obviously a big anti-nuclear lobby. You know, this is what I don't get. The people who are against nuclear are trying to save the environment. Okay, it's utterly ridiculous if you understand that nuclear is probably the best solution to save the environment. But let's talk about the competitor, because this is what they don't want to tell you. You know, guys who are against nuclear are trying to sell you solar and wind, and they are trying to promise us that the cost of solar panels and wind has gotten cheaper, which is true. The cost of generation might be a little bit cheaper. That's also true. But they're not telling you that the consumer cost is more expensive. And can you maybe explain the paradox of why why wind and solar is falling in production, and yet the consumers are paying more money?
Well, there are a couple of things. One is that obviously there's mass production going on. If you build a complex of townhouses, of 50 townhouses, then the first one will cost you a certain amount of money, but then all you do is copy it for the other 49. So obviously your construction costs come down. So there's mass production now of solar panels and wind turbines going on. So from that point of view, their price will come down. But it's also the case that what they do is they quote the price of supply at their front gate, not the price when I turn on my lights at home. And then another factor comes in, and that is the difference between a commodity and a service. People tend to forget that when you have electricity, it's predominantly a service. You want to know that any time of the day, you want to flick the light switch on and the lights come on. Whereas if you sell it as a commodity, if you say, look, solar power costs you so much, but you only get it in the middle of the daytime. In other words, solar power will never power your television at night, and it'll never be used to switch the lights on, unless you now go to battery storage and all these other shifting mechanisms, which are now they're telling us are necessary. So telling me what the cost of solar power is at their front gate at lunchtime, when I want the electricity in my house at nighttime, doesn't help at all. So you can't just quote megawatt hours or terawatt or gigawatt hours. That is wrong. The hours is the total collected amount. It's like saying I use 300 liters of milk in a year. Great. If somebody delivers a liter to me every day, then I'm okay for the year. But not if they give me 100 liters in January, 2 liters in February, and another 100 liters in March. That is a completely different ballgame. And so this megawatt hours, which is the total amount, as against megawatts, which is what have you got now to turn the lights on, or what has a factory got now, or what has a South African gold mine got now when you've got 4,000 people underground, 3 kilometers down, and the electricity goes off, and these people are dependent on an air conditioning system, the hoists to get them back to the server. You can't risk thousands of people underground when the power fails. So being available 24 hours a day, the base load factor is incredibly important. And this is skipped over. And unfortunately, here in South Africa and in Africa generally, there's far too much acceptance of European standards. You're in Paris at the moment.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you will find that the lifestyle in Paris is different to the lifestyle here in Pretoria. Yeah. There's lots of factors which are different. So it's just wrong for African countries to be looking to France, Germany, and so on for a solution. We can look at them for ideas and say what works and doesn't work and so on, but not that whatever they decide is the right way to do it in Europe has got to somehow be the right way for us. It isn't. We've got to have the courage of our convictions to do what works for us, for our big gold mines, for our trains which run hundreds of kilometers through places that need long-range power lines and massive trains that need a lot of power. So it's completely different to a train running around in Switzerland.
Yeah, and the other thing is in Europe, I mean, particularly in Germany, and Denmark, there's a growing skepticism of this so-called environmental pro-green wind battery solution. Energy poverty has increased in Germany. The Germans are struggling to pay their electricity bill. And in California, you see the same thing. In Denmark, it's a little bit better, but you still see something like this. And, you know, I'm not a grid analyst, electrical engineer specialist, but something tells me that the guys who have been criticizing it from the beginning, saying, listen, you're adding complexity to a system, because logic tells you that if you've got one source that supplies power, it's always going to be cheaper than having three different things in your grid. You know, if you can mix solar, batteries, whatever. And then my question to these guys has always been, have you been to South Africa? Have you been to the South Deep mine in Johannesburg? Have you been to Lonmin? Show me the battery that is going to power Lonmin. Show me the battery that's going to power Zimbabwe, or the solar panel that's going to give us, put our lights on. I think it's complete fantasy what they are trying to sell us, and I think we need to push back against that. If you have an opinion on that.
Yeah, well, I was actually guest speaker at African Union Economic Summit a couple of years ago, and there were about 200 people there. Very senior people, presidents and prime ministers were there as well. And I pointed this out because also you'll find that numbers of African countries are either wholly dependent or nearly wholly dependent on hydro. Now, a classic hydro country that does very well out of hydro is Norway. Now, Norway has dams that effectively look like this in the fjords, and they have ice and snow and rain and so on that guarantees that something like this is always full. An African dam looks more like a saucer, like this. Wide, large diameter, flat pans. We don't have these very vertical types of dams that you get in Europe. So here in South Africa, just a year or so ago, we were at the tail end, in fact, still not entirely out of it, of a large drought. It's not uncommon here to have droughts that last 5 years. In Cape Town, they were at a panicky state of affairs where it looked as if they might run out of drinking water. They were down to rationing water and so on and so forth. Luckily enough, those dams that were supplying the drinking water were not supplying electricity. But you can imagine if one of these large saucer-shaped African dams loses 50% of its water, it's lost all that hydrostatic head and the volume of water to drive the power. I was actually giving a seminar with African countries, a number of other African countries, and they point out, I said, look, if it doesn't rain, we lose electricity. And I said, good heavens, you know, it's really bad to lose 10 or 15%. And the fellows from Tanzania said, no, it's not 10 or 15%, it's half. And they later showed me graphs to show me that one power plant, hydro plant, had lost 73% of its output because the water was down. Wow. And whole areas had lost half. 5-10% variation in a nation's electricity supply in the 21st century is serious. Half is completely out of the question. You can't design the 21st century country with industrial intentions and so on the basis that your electricity supply is going up and down like this by tens of percent. You just can't do that. And so even hydro in Africa is not an answer at the end of the day. They've got to have some baseload power, which is far more reliable than that. And it's not solar, which is only there during lunchtime. And it's not wind, which is highly intermittent. And as I mentioned earlier, the large distances, you've got to go for the wind to where the wind is. And that doesn't mean that's where you want the power. You can't put up a wind collection point somewhere and then find the industrial centers 400 kilometers away. Those sorts of concepts don't exist in most of Europe. There, 100 kilometers drive is a very long way. Here, 100 kilometers is nothing. I do that for a meeting as regular as clockwork. I live in Pretoria. Johannesburg's 50, 60 kilometers away. I regularly drive there and back for a meeting without blinking. And so to us, 100 kilometers is close by. Yeah. And that's why our thinking is different.
So, yeah, the thinking is space. I mean, Africa is, as you say, it's not a very dense populated area. We're very sparse over it. We can have big houses, which is what I miss, to be honest. And we have nature reserves, and we can have all the luxuries of life, but we need power. And the other thing that goes missing in this discussion is rivers. Europe has got, and America has got rivers for cheap transport. Africa doesn't have the luxury. I don't think there's a single river in Africa, with the exception maybe of the Nile, that you can put a ship in. And I think the Nile, even there's a limit to the amount of ships you can put on it. So we need railway, okay, for our freight. We need highways for our cars. You cannot run a high-speed rail system while you need your freight, for example. It's another one of the misconceptions they've got. I've got a question here for you, which they say, what is holding nuclear power back in South Africa? Is it political? Is there something else? Or given the minister's new proposal, are you more optimistic that we're going to get it?
I'm very optimistic with the way that the minister is moving now. The previous minister was a completely different ballgame. And luckily for the past year now, we've had Mr. Mantashe, who's been a lot more focused and structured on what actually needs to be done. He's also Minister of Mineral Affairs, that's mineral and energy. So he's very conscious that places like the gold mines need the electricity. It's not just producing electricity, it's using it as well.
Right.
I think that we suffered here just like the rest of the world did. Post 2008, there was the international financial problem. There was then a big anti-nuclear move. There was this incredible enthusiasm towards wind and solar, which is just not working out now. It's plain and simply false, to put it bluntly. So I think that the mood is changing. Also, you'll find that a lot of African countries whom I speak to, and that they are being very wise and saying, look, if we look at our realities, like I said earlier, we've got to make decisions. And this is where something like the small modular reactor class, the Generation 4 class, is what we want. South Africa designed this pebble bed modular reactor, which we could have built way back in about 2008. In fact, probably 3 or 4 years earlier, we could have started building that reactor. And had we done it, we'd have one running today of 100, 200 megawatts, that sort of order, which we specifically designed at the time to be independent of water cooling from the ocean. Because as you said, the rivers, South Africa has very little water inland, and Africa generally has not got huge lakes and navigable rivers and this type of thing. So being water independent is very important. So that was designed. Then that one unfortunately went into hibernation, but that's being resurrected now. There are people that are wanting to get it going again. But meantime, 2 other reactor designs also came about. One was within Eskom, a more advanced reactor concept than the PBMR, an advanced pebble bed reactor, which had a higher operating temperature, therefore was a better reactor on paper and so on, but a much more complex one to build. And then another one which had a lower temperature, more simple version, which is the HTMR 100. And the HTMR 100 was pursued by a private group in Pretoria that went quite far with that reactor. They're still working on that work now as I speak to you, and they would be very pleased to get it going again.
Thorium reactor, if I understand.
An output temperature still of some 750 degrees. And there you mentioned the supply lines, like the lack of navigable rivers and so on. And that, of course, is a very big factor. Because South Africa manufactures the pebble bed fuel. We made the fuel again. We're in a position now where the fuel can be manufactured again almost overnight. The technology is all there, but it also went into hibernation. But I foresee now that this pebble bed type fuel being supplied from South Africa into other African countries. But that means long drives by road, or however the political authorities decide it can be moved. Now, I'm sure the Zambians, the Rwandans, the Ugandans, and so on would be far more secure in their minds knowing that they own a nuclear reactor like an HTMR 100, that they can determine when the reactor is running, not running, and so on, and that their fuel is coming from South Africa. Not that they've got to rely on something like imported oil from the Middle East or things like that, which are worrying. And as one African energy minister said to me, they wouldn't go coal, plain and simply because the only coal they could get was from South Africa. And although we have the coal, it would have to cross 4 international borders on the long journey from here to them. He said, we can't risk a supply line where daily coal trains have got to run through 4 international borders. There's the politics of whether or not you can cross the border. And in Africa, you can have a flood or something can happen that railway line gets blocked or harmed, and it's a long way from repair teams and so on. So it's quite understandable that African countries far from the coastline are not going to want to rely on imported coal or imported gas. They've then got to worry about ships coming and bringing in gas and somehow getting huge volumes of gas from the coast in deep into. It's just not on if you just think of the logic of it. So to me, a small modular reactor of the HTMR 100 type is exactly the type of thing you want to find being used in many African countries. There's about a dozen right now that are ready to start overnight, so to speak. And in fact, many have, in the sense that they've got nuclear legislation on their books, and they've got nuclear bodies that are now operating and debating. I've met a number of them. So hopefully they will pursue that line of thought.
So do you think then, first let's get to the thorium reactors. South Africa was one of the first countries in the world to look at thorium reactors. And of course, can you maybe explain the advantage of a thorium reactor as opposed to the old, pebble bed, pressure water reactors?
Well, right at the beginning of nuclear, way back in the 1950s, a few years after the Second World War, when the weapons were developed, it was recognized that thorium and uranium would both work as nuclear fuels. They were both investigated, but then decisions had to be made which way to go, and the authorities of the day used the uranium route. As it happened back then, thorium was being mined in the Western Cape in South Africa from a very rich thorium mine, and was supplied to both the US and the UK to run reactors in those very early days. But the flavor of the time went in the direction of uranium, and so thorium was put aside. However, there's a lot of thorium spread around the world, and great advantages of thorium is it produces the waste at the end, which is a much more friendly type of waste, say, than the uranium waste. It also has a few other advantages that are useful. And so you can't divert it for weapons purposes, for example. It's not going to readily give you something for weapons. So there are a number of considerations like that that make thorium very attractive. And in fact, the HTMR 100 was designed to be able to take thorium as well. And already nearly a decade ago, thorium trials were carried out with this HTMR 100 in mind. Were carried out in a Nordic country and various other countries in Germany and so on. And that fuel came out with flying colors. So there's absolutely every reason to believe that thorium is a very good fuel. There's different types of reactors. One is the solid balls, which is the pebble bed modular reactor. A ball is about as big as a cricket ball. And in the case of the South African design, with 9 grams of uranium in one of those balls. And it's solid. You can throw the ball on a concrete floor and it'll bounce and so on. So it's very friendly towards long-range transport without it getting damaged and so on. And another route is a liquid salt reactor based on thorium. And what happens there is that the fuel actually flows in a liquid form through the core of the reactor. An advantage of that method is that you have a salt plug at the bottom. If anything happens and it overheats, it melts. and the stuff all runs out at the bottom and spreads itself out. And so you're not going to get a runaway nuclear reaction or anything of that nature, which incidentally was a major factor in the design of the PBMR and the HEMTMR 100. They were both designed that if the worst of the worst happens, and whatever crisis you want to imagine, and the staff just pack it in and walk out and go home and just leave the place alone, it cannot overheat and lead to a core meltdown. In the case of the pebble bed, the temperature will rise up a bit, and over the next 3, 4, 5 days or so, will just go over a peak, which is still way far from being dangerous, and it will then just cool itself off. So all of those things have been addressed. People like to tell you how much solar has advanced with modern technology. Of course, solar cells, polycrystalline solar is far different to the early days of single cell solar. And the wind turbines are obviously beautiful physics in the shape of the turbine blades and the massive turbines that are now being built, and so on. So it has advanced a lot. People forget that nuclear has advanced immensely as well since the first reactors went online at the end of the 50s and the beginning of the 60s, power reactors to produce electricity. There's a huge difference. So these specters of reactors splitting open and contaminating whole cities and false images of nuclear explosions, all those are just plain and simply wrong. Most of it wasn't ever true, and it's not even remotely near true now. That doesn't happen anymore. There's fail-safe types of mechanisms that are in these modern big reactors that South Africa's got in mind to build along the coast of the Three Capes. So it's very secure. I would happily build a house on the grounds of Koeberg nuclear reactor and live there. Yes, there's no fear at all. They've got highly competent staff, and Ridwan Bakkedin, the head of nuclear for Eskom, and Alapian Thuli, the power station manager there at Koeberg, and very competent people. So the Cape Townians and everybody who live around can relax. I've actually got a friend who lives virtually on the fence of Koeberg, and he's got a great place, and him and his neighbors are very relaxed about it. It's the people that are further away that hear the scare stories only.
But the scare stories is just ignorance. There's just as many people, way more people dying of coal. But I want to get to this important point following from here. By the end of this century, according to UN predictions, and it is predictions, sometimes they can be taken as prophecy, 40% of the world's population will be African. Okay, Africa will be there will be as many Africans, I think, as Chinese and Indians combined at the time, something like that, at the end of the century. These people in Africa, we want to live like the Europeans do, with nice standard of living. And to get that, you need energy. You need energy, you need water, you need food, you need transport, you need all the aspects that makes life. And at the moment, what you're hearing from Europe is climate change, the Green New Deal in America. And essentially what they're saying is Africa cannot have coal. Okay, the exact same people are saying we don't want nuclear because the EU right now said they do not consider nuclear to be green technology. It's complete rubbish. It emits less carbon than solar and wind, for example. I think this one that maybe beat them. But Africa wants to develop. How are we going to do it? Okay, should we just ignore what the UN and the EU and the World Bank and the IMF tells us and go our own way? Or should they change their mind? What should our approach be to them?
Well, we mustn't absolutely ignore them, but we've got to have the courage of our convictions to say we're doing it our way. You're quite right. We need development here. In numbers of African countries, they are like 15% electrified. South Africa is like 85 plus, and we've still got a way to go to get everybody onto electricity. But some African countries are like 15. The only honorable thing for them to do is double electricity consumption, then double it again, and double it again, and double it again. South Africa must double. And I'm one of the people that does not believe that human-induced climate change is an issue. This whole carbon dioxide thing is incorrect to my mind. The small temperature increase that has been detected in the atmosphere since the time of the Crimean War, for example, way back then, is minute and is totally able to be explained by magnetic variations in the sun that alter the screening of incoming cosmic rays around the Earth. I don't want to go into that in great detail. So I don't believe that the CO2 is an issue. Even if it was, the nuclear is by far the greenest, safest, and cheapest of all power sources. There's no doubt about that. It's not an opinion, it's provable. You can see it. there just is an incredibly safe record in nuclear power. As I indicated to you, even with Fukushima, nobody died and nobody was hurt from nuclear radiation.
Right.
So all indications are that that is the answer. And African countries must say, we want power for our people, electricity. And that means they must just do what is necessary. You go and have a look, and I've been into mud huts in various African countries, in South Africa as well. There are people that sit there cooking dinner on dung fires outdoors and wood fires. They're cutting down the trees. When I was in Zambia, I saw numbers of people along the side of the long roads going out of the capital, cutting trees down that were greater diameter than my body, and selling them on the side of the road to people going home for the weekend. Now, that's supposed to be the environmentally friendly option, is it? A wood fire at home that somebody's cutting all the trees down on the side of the freeway and selling them to people driving past. That's what's happening. And then another thing is that they have paraffin in the houses. I had cause to look into paraffin a few years ago, and the figures for paraffin are horrendous. The number of children in South Africa that get killed and injured by paraffin every year, because little kids come along and the mother has a paraffin stove running on the kitchen floor or somewhere. And those things are inherently unstable because they put a heavy pot of water on top. The number of kids that have knocked paraffin stoves over and they've burst into flames and the children have got badly burnt. But also the children drink the stuff. The mothers get paraffin refills in like Coca-Cola bottles. And somehow the little kids can't tell the difference. They don't seem to be able to taste it. They take this bottle of paraffin and they drink it, only to be rushed off to hospital and in many instances die from the poisoning. So things like paraffin and dung fires and wood fires and charcoal fires, which people put in their buildings at night in the winter and then close up the building and you get carbon monoxide fumes that then kill people. All of that is just horrendous. They would never tolerate that in London or New York or Paris, where you are now, and so on. But they expect us to do it and abide by their rules. It's just plain and simply wrong. They're incorrect. And I believe that nuclear and coal, by the way, South Africa must go the route of coal inland and nuclear on the coast with the smaller, like HTMR 100 type reactors inland at places like Carletonville, which is a major mining center. And that's the type of thing we must do. Look at what we need for our country and do it. And be prepared to argue with the first world who tells us to toe their line because they believe they know what's better for us. They don't.
Yeah, that's why, if you listen to many African leaders and what they call neo-colonialism or patronism, that's exactly what they're referring to. It's this attitude that we need to listen to Brussels and London and Paris and whoever, and they are going to manage our lives for us. And I just think most people in Africa are fed up and they're not going to take it much longer. And we have no reason why we should take it. I think it's something like a third of all the coal in Europe comes from South Africa. So they're very good enough to use our coal, but they want to preach to us not to burn it. Germany, after the Energiewende, added more coal power stations to its grid than the entire Africa combined. So I see no reason why Africa should make any excuses to burn coal. The Europeans can deindustrialize themselves if they want to, and if they believe renewables work. I think we should go on a different path.
Germany is currently building new coal-fired power stations very quietly. Being big protagonists of wind and solar, they're still building coal-fired power stations quietly behind the scenes. So they realize that it's a lot easier to talk about getting rid of it than to actually do it.
That's right. And the Germans shot themselves in the foot. My metaphor for them is the Lufthansa air pilot that crashed, high-tech energy going to the mountain. And that's what they're doing with all the industries. But what be that as it may, that's their decision. I don't think we should do so. We should burn coal and we should use nuclear, as you say. You said to me you're optimistic about nuclear energy, obviously. How long do you think we will take before we see the construction of a first nuclear power plant in South Africa?
Well, I'd like to see us start effectively next year, in the sense that what's necessary is for the minister and the sequence of regulations that to say go ahead, and that would be then the start. They wouldn't be pouring concrete, but that would mean that you could start planning towards that. I think nuclear can be built in 5 or 6 years. These stories that people tell you that's 10 years or something, there again, they exaggerate and try to twist the thing. And we also in South Africa have got to see what we can do about electricity supplies for the next half dozen years, as well as the next half dozen months. everybody tends to be focused on the next half dozen months because that's what happens if the power goes out, your lights don't work today. But what about the next half dozen years? We've had President Ramaphosa of South Africa asking for foreign investment, and there's been a very positive reaction to foreign investment. But clearly people say, I'm only going to build a new motor car plant in South Africa if you can tell me I'll have adequate electricity for the next decade. They're not going to do it if it's not there. So it's a foundation to be able to go ahead. And the same is true of the other African countries, any other African country. And it's in our interests as South Africans for neighboring African countries and neighbors of neighbors and so on to have adequate electricity because they're trading partners of ours. It's pointless us believing we can manufacture something like fridges or stoves and sell them to other African countries when the other African countries don't have electricity. So if we want to sell fridges and stoves and buy their various goods and so on and so forth, it means that both countries are advancing with electricity supplies, all of them. So it's in our interest for everybody to do it and to aim for things like small modular reactors, of which there's a number being planned for. Now, you can see around the world, there's been a huge resurgence of interest in small modular reactors. The International Atomic Energy Agency, the Small Modular Reactor Unit, brought out a booklet a few weeks ago showing 72, if I remember correctly, small modular reactor designs currently listed in the world. And this is the number that are being looked at, from things like the liquid reactors that you mentioned earlier on to the solid fuel ball type reactors. All sorts of designs are on the table now for consideration. I'm also somebody who's, from a hobbyist point of view, interested in space travel and the journeys to the moon and to Mars. I watch with great fascination. The power supply on Mars is going to be something like a small modular reactor. It's not a solar panel. It's going to be nuclear reactors that you take up a la Lego and you put them together there, and fuel balls can be transported by rocket, for example. So that is the answer. The answer is small modular reactors, even smaller than 100. It'll be down to like a 1 megawatt reactor, something of that nature, that can be constructed. Because also bear in mind that a nuclear power plant is not nuclear until the moment you put nuclear fuel in it.
Correct.
All the construction of the steel and the concrete, you can walk around inside the core of the nuclear reactor until the day at which somebody signs a piece of paper to say nuclear material is coming onto site. So building a reactor on Mars, for argument's sake, can be done by hand with spanners and whatever type of construction methods they come up with at that time. And it's only the day that you put the nuclear fuel in that it's got to be treated in a different way. So it's perfectly feasible to build something like that. And that type of plant will also be able to be used on Earth in all sorts of places where you want a smallish amount of power far away from supply lines. And to my mind, there's just a huge vista of opportunity for nuclear in the world to come. And in a century's time or half a century, school teachers will tell children way back at the beginning of the 21st century, they were doubting nuclear. And believe it or not, like when horses were giving way to trams and motor cars in the world, people had doubts. The same thing happened in the 2010s and the 2020s, where people worried about nuclear. Look now where everything is nuclear. We can look back at those primitive days when they went through the mental transition to accepting nuclear as inevitable as the basis of world progress.
So you say the psychologists actually need to speak to the public a bit to try and just get them to accept what is reality. And I share that view. I mean, I would love to see the whole world by the end of the century, I'll probably not be alive by then, to be nuclear powered. I think it would be wonderful. It's quite a fascinating thing to think of. I suppose the last question is here. Africa is developing, as we mentioned. Africa, has got a young population, which is always great for development. Obviously, they need to be educated, and it's sometimes a bit of a challenge, but they are educated. Do you see Africa, perhaps, that we can get an industrial revolution based on nuclear power and its spin-offs? Is that a plausible vision for Africa?
Absolutely. If you look at the first industrial revolution in the UK, it dramatically changed the lifestyles of people. They could start to move. The Industrial Revolution, which was based on coal power coming about, enabling them to have the energy to make things like steam engines, to make things like railway lines that needed to be able to produce the steel and so on. That enabled people to move around. It altered the whole mechanisms of trade and so on and so forth. If you look at what the Industrial Revolution actually did for the lives of people, it was dramatic what happened. So many African countries absolutely now need fundamental energy, and the fundamental energy in the modern world is electricity, basically. With large amounts of electricity coming about, that's why I said the only honorable thing for any African country is to aim for as fast an increase of 100% as possible, not this limiting to a few percent as some European countries tell us, 100% immediately, as fast as possible. They should be doing that, and that's going to dramatically change the lifestyle of people. It'll not only change the ability of the housewife to turn on a switch, but it'll also mean the transport becomes different. There'll be better education for children. There'll be electric trains to move them around. There'll be an internet connection in your house. They'll be able to use a computer instead of going to bed at night with a fire. And this is the type of thing. So the change that will come about is dramatic. And I've got great belief in the intelligence of people generally, and very much the intelligence of the people in African countries. I've got numbers of friends all over the place. They're smart as can be. They know what needs to be done. Give them the opportunity to develop, and they will do the right thing sensibly. I've got no doubt about that. So let's stop trying to ask the Europeans and other people to tell them what they should be doing according to a European model. No, that's wrong.
No, and we are not telling Europe what to do. I think they should stop telling us what to do. I think that is the lesson that needs to be. I guess there's so since we've gone a little bit over time, investors, as you say, are looking at it. The policy is now there. If you were to advise any investor as to where to put his money in nuclear in Africa, where would you tell him to do it at the moment?
Well, there's something like the HTMR100 nuclear reactor, which is privately owned, I emphasize. So in fact, people can put money in it tomorrow morning if they want to. There's nothing to stop them doing that. And some people have already done so. So there's things like that. But I think that I'd like to say to investors, start listening to the technological people, what is inevitable and what must happen, and not to the bankers, because sadly the bankers, I don't want to be too nasty to them, but too many of the bankers are listening to Greenpeace and people like that and getting their information out of an ordinary local newspaper. I sit and I talk to some of the bankers, and I'm appalled at their lack of understanding of how electricity works and so on. So I think it's necessary to listen to the technical people. In the days when Henry Ford was saying motor cars will work, and other people were saying things like that, it was difficult sometimes to listen to them of this newfangled idea like a motor car taking over from a horse, but it did. And the same is going to happen with electricity, and electricity being generated from a range of nuclear reactors from 1,500 megawatt sizes all the way down to a couple of hundred megawatts down to a few megawatts and so on. All of those will come about. So I think that there's a great future for people to have the courage to invest where it's the right thing to do.
Dr. Kelvin, thank you very much for that. I really appreciate it. And thank you for the hour that you've given. Just hold on a bit while I close it. I just want to ask you some private questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me to be on here. And I hope you're enjoying Paris. It's certainly hot here in